On May the 3rd, Germany marked the 70th anniversary of the liberation of the Dachau concentration camp. About 40,000 Jews and others were killed there. Playing a key role in the liberation were Japanese-American soldiers. They were Nisei, American citizens whose parents were Japanese immigrants. Shortly after the start of the Pacific War, the US government declared Japanese Americans enemy aliens. Many Nisei joined the military to show their loyalty to America. They were always assigned to the front lines, and if they got wounded, they'd be sent right back after they recovered. After the war, most of them chose not to talk about their experience, even to their families. They thought this would help their children integrate into US society.
It bothered me for 7 years. I still can't sleep.
Japanese Americans had a rough experience in the turbulent wartime period. Let's hear what Nisei have to say 70 years after the end of the war.
Welcome to today's Close-Up. I'm Hiroko Kuniya. Japanese Americans are today regarded as one of the most socially and economically successful minority groups in the United States. But as individuals, Japan-born immigrants and their children had little power during the war. Their lives were turned upside down. Barbed wire symbolizes the harsh situation they endured during the war. When World War II began, Japanese immigrants were suspected of being disloyal to the U.S. and sent to internment camps. They were stripped of their freedom and dignity. Despite the severe discrimination they faced, many of the young Nisei, U.S. citizens born in America to Japanese parents, joined the military campaigns in Europe and the Pacific. How did they feel about fighting in the war, leaving their families behind in the internment camps? And how did their actions affect the situation of Japanese Americans in U.S. society after the war? The U.S. Army's 442nd Regimental Combat Team, made up of Japanese Americans, remains the most decorated unit in U.S. military history. President Barack Obama recently awarded the regiment the country's highest decoration. The unit was sent to fight in extremely fierce battles, and its members suffered particularly high casualty rates. In 1988, the government made an official apology over the internment of Japanese Americans and offered reparations to those who were detained. But even after the government acknowledged the policy was a mistake, many former soldiers kept their battlefield memories to themselves. 70 years have passed since the war ended, and most of the veterans are over the age of 90. After a long and heavy silence, some are just now starting to talk about their experiences.
In San Francisco in February, Nisei veterans who fought in Europe during World War II gathered for a ceremony.
And I'm glad to see you're still able to get around.
Yeah, just barely getting around.
You joined the U.S. Army at the age of 21.
The French government decorated them for their role in liberating France from Nazi Germany.
Africa Middle Eastern Theater Medal, the World War II Victory Medal, and the...
Many Nisei soldiers were sent to scenes of heavy fighting in Europe. This was triggered by an incident in 1941. In December of that year, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The US government designated Japanese Americans enemy aliens out of fear they would act as spies for Japan. The government relocated those living on the West Coast to internment camps. About 120,000 people were sent to the camps. They were deprived of their assets, livelihoods, and freedom, and were forced to live on barren fields.
Hello. Hi.
91-year-old Masao Kadota is one of the veterans who took part in the ceremony in San Francisco. He was sent to an internment camp at the age of 18.
Hello. This is my wife, Hoshiko Kadota.
Hello. How are you? No teeth.
He only recently began talking about his experiences there. He says he's never forgotten the discrimination he and other Japanese Americans faced at the camp.
They had guards on the tower watching over us. We couldn't do anything, get close to the fence there, otherwise they tell us to move. So we're just like a prisoner.
About a year and a half later, the war was intensifying. The US government sought out Japanese Americans to serve in the military. Kadota saw a contradiction in the policy, but decided to join the army.
Why my American citizen has to go to camp and fight for America? Well, you know, that don't call us enemy aliens. We ought to be able to call American citizen.
Kadota became a member of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which was made up of Japanese Americans. In 1943, the unit arrived in Italy and advanced north, driving back German forces. It later moved on to France and arrived in Germany near the end of the war. This footage of the regiment was filmed by the US military. The unit was assigned to tougher missions than other regiments. Japanese American soldiers were always ordered to fight on the front lines and to lead the way in breaking enemy defenses.
Always on top of the mountain, and we'll always try to go up the hill and try to get them. You're lucky you don't get shot or anything. "14,000 soldiers served in the 442nd Regiment. By the end of the war, more than 4,000 of them were killed or wounded. That's a casualty rate 3 times that of most other units. Why were so many Japanese American soldiers killed? An expert on the European theater of World War II says the US military regarded Nisei soldiers as expendable.
If they died, it wasn't the worst thing. They were considered expendable. Yes, they were sent there and could be sacrificed.
The regiment was always sent to areas of the heaviest fighting. One Nisei veteran says he took part in one of the war's fiercest battles. Sheikh Doi is 95 years old.
It's on the top, you know, so one little top on the top is coming out.
In October 1944, he and 1,200 other troops were ordered to rescue about 270 white US soldiers surrounded by Nazi forces. The mission took place in a dense forest. The enemy was camouflaged. Doi and his unit were advancing when gunfire suddenly erupted all around them. They responded by advancing toward where they thought the shots were coming from.
You have to be in the front line to see. You know, on the Vosges, the heck, as people get blown up and your intestines is hanging on a tree. Half of your brains are blown pieces. And the hardest part of the infantry is to live every day. If you got $1 million wound, it got shot through the leg, you're happy because you're off the line.
After 4 days of battle, most of the white soldiers were rescued. But more than 800 members of the Japanese-American unit had been killed or wounded. The inhumanity of people killing each other and the different values placed on lives based on race. Doi says he understands that's what war is about. But his mind still struggles with the memories.
It bothers me for 70 years. I still can't sleep. There's no way. That's why I don't want it. You can't get away from it.
Members of the Nisei Regiment continued to fight the enemy and their own conflicts to earn a place as true American citizens. Near the end of the war, Japanese-American soldiers witnessed a shocking sight in Germany. 95-year-old Susumu Ito recalls the scene.
For many years.
In April 1945, his unit took part in the liberation of the Dachau concentration camp. About 200,000 people, mainly Jews, had been imprisoned there. 40,000 of them were killed.
It was very unusual snow. Many were dead along the road. Many of the prisoners that were walking or trying to walk were very, very thin and almost like skeletons. So it was a shocking sight. It was a depressing sight.
For the Nisei soldiers who had left their families behind in internment camps, Dachau was the embodiment of a war that crushed human dignity.
The injustice that was done, of course I would think back to my family and friends who were in American camps. I felt, and most of them felt, that how could this happen? How could one human being do that to a group of people, not individual, but a group of people as a whole, because of their background and their religion.
Joining us is Kyoto University professor Yasuko Takezawa, an expert on the Japanese-American experience. The Nisei unit contributed to the liberation of the Nazi concentration camp at Dachau. As Mr. Ito said in the video, it's likely the soldiers had complicated feelings.
The Nisei veterans say they were always thinking about their parents on the battlefield. The U.S., regarded as a country that champions freedom and equality, rescued Jews from the Nazis. But on the other hand, it violated its own constitution and deprived Japanese Americans of their rights and assets, treating them like prisoners. The Nisei may have felt grave contradictions.
The soldiers were thinking of their parents back home. At the same time, they wanted to be recognized as Americans. For that to happen, they had to risk their lives fighting for the U.S. How could they make such a decision? And what feelings led them there?
They fought in a harsh war. I think the psychological strength that helped them survive the war shows how tough the discrimination was. They likely thought they'd always be treated as second-class Americans if they refused to go to war. And then they would face the prospect of spending the rest of their lives in internment camps, surrounded by barbed wire. They may have thought that they had to take a chance and do something extraordinary to change the situation.
Well, didn't they have doubts about fighting for the U.S. in light of the unfair treatment of Japanese Americans? Wouldn't there have been disagreements between those who enlisted as soldiers and their parents, brothers and sisters?
I heard they would discuss the matter for days and days on end. Generally speaking, the parents, who came to the U.S. as immigrants, had been born and educated in Japan and had sympathy for the Japanese emperor. But the Nisei were American citizens, and most of them wanted to show allegiance to the U.S. This helped drive a wedge between families and friends. It remained that way for decades.
One expert in the video said Nisei soldiers may have been seen as expendable. They were forced to fight in such fierce battles, and so many of them lost their lives. They had already received unfair treatment by being interned. Do you think they were discriminated against in the military and on the battlefield as well?
There are two different views. One says Nisei soldiers were treated as expendable. The other says they were sent to the front lines because they were such skilled fighters. If the former, the bereaved families would find it hard to accept the deaths of their loved ones. A letter by a senior U.S. military officer during the war rated Nisei soldiers very high for their outstanding fighting ability and loyalty. So we can't categorically accept the expendable theory. But ordering them to face enemy forces 3 times the size of their unit, forcing them to charge up hills in the face of heavy fire, that's really harsh. It makes me wonder if their lives may have been regarded as less valuable than those of white Americans. Perhaps their value was just a fraction of that placed on the lives of white Americans.
You said Nisei soldiers may have thought they needed to take action to reverse the discrimination faced by Japanese Americans. Did the situation in fact change when they came home?
It changed dramatically. Nobody can deny that the soldiers risked their lives in the war for the sake of the U.S. I'm sure their service has played a major role in Japanese Americans achieving a higher status in post-war U.S. society.
The Nisei veterans only recently began talking about their experiences. Why did they remain silent for so long? The answer is in the social environment of the post-war period.
A museum in Los Angeles is dedicated to showcasing the history of Japanese Americans. Even 70 years after the end of the war, it continues to receive items related to Nisei veterans and their families.
We have a depiction of a Nisei veteran going off, and that's a son and body that the mother looks like is giving.
This is a scrapbook kept by a woman who lived in an internment camp.
This is, sadly, a memorial for what I presume to be Nisei soldiers who passed away. And the inscription here is, "They shall not have died in vain."
The Nisei soldiers struggled with internal conflicts while serving their country. Many of those who survived the war could not speak of their suffering for a long time.
The Nisei, by and large, did not talk about these stories. They wanted to shield the Sansei and the other generations from some of the pain and the sad memories that they had to endure.
Shigdoi lost many Nisei comrades in the mission to rescue the unit of white American troops.
The Nisei fellow said, "Toshi tottara dame yo," that's it.
He went on to raise 4 children, working as a farmer and X-ray technician. He never told his children about the hardships he endured before and during the war. He saw no need to bring up the past if Japanese Americans were to integrate into society and be free from discrimination.
I want my children to be better than I am. Forget about your dad or your father went through. You know, it doesn't bring it back. It doesn't do anything.
But in the 1970s, Japanese Americans began a new movement. Grandchildren of Japan-born immigrants urged their parents and grandparents to speak out and forced the government to acknowledge their suffering in the internment camps. In 1988, the movement led then-President Ronald Reagan to announce reparations for the former internees.
We must recognize that the internment of Japanese Americans was just that, a mistake.
The U.S. government officially apologized for its policy. From then on, the history of the internment camps gradually emerged.
About 23.
But many Nisei remained silent about their brutal experiences on the battlefield.
Frenchman will pick you up and
Now, 70 years after the war ended, surviving veterans want history to remember their experience.
they won't get it right. It's hard to dig those history out. You want to forget it, you know. But nature doesn't make you forget it. It's inside of you. It's always buried inside of you, you know.
We can keenly feel how harsh memories from 70 years ago still haunt the former Nisei soldiers. Third-generation Japanese Americans are known as sansei. They have no direct experience of the war, but urged their parents to speak up.
The Asian American movement began in the 1970s. Sansei learned about the war from people outside their community, not from their parents. They found out about it in high school or college. They were angry that nobody in the community had told them the stories. That's how the movement began, including the effort to seek reparations.
That reminds me of the importance of understanding the truth. The movement led to apologies and reparations from the authorities. Why was it successful?
First, the ideals of the movement have been passed down. When calls mounted in the U.S. to put Arab Americans into internment camps after the September 11th terrorist attacks, Japanese Americans voiced their opposition. They said it would be a repeat of what the government did to their grandparents after Pearl Harbor. The second is that members of the movement didn't accuse white people directly. They clearly distinguished between white people and white racism, or white people and the government. That helped avoid placing the movement in the context of racial or ethnic conflict. By treating the matter as a universal problem, they succeeded in gaining broad sympathy.
Nisei veterans appear to have more to say, but time is running out for them.
They've just started to talk.
Thank you for joining us. That was Yasuko Takezawa